Being able to cope when a student's trauma is a reminder of your own trauma is a situation that is particularly important and deserves its own slide. When a student's trauma is triggering your own traumatic experiences, you may be particularly vulnerable to STS, or in some cases, you may develop PTSD as thoughts and images from your own experiences suddenly intrude your mind. Perhaps you have struggled with PTSD years ago as a result of your traumatic experiences, or maybe you're beginning to experience PTSD symptoms for the first time as a result of being triggered by your student's experience. Either way, it is important to recognize the situation and you need to actively take care of yourself. If not, the situation may end up impacting your work and your home life. Being able to recognize the connection between your student's trauma and your own history is important. With my experience on this, it is talking with students about death, which leads me to bring back the experiences I suffered and I went through when dealing with my own parents' death. It can be a difficult conversation that I have to have with my students, depending on the impact that the death that they are going through and how it impacts them. I also need to remind myself of the resiliency that students have and the trust that they are looking for in me. At this point, that's when I may tend to lean more towards the compassion side instead of empathy and so that it helps me to deal with my own feelings. Just as a reminder, compassion is feeling for the person in the state of mind that they are in without attempting to know what is going on through their minds. Where empathy, like we talked about last time, is really understanding and putting yourself in their shoes, understanding and being able to relate with how they feel. If it becomes too close of an issue, using that extreme compassion is important. If you are triggered by a student's trauma, you might seem to be overstepping your boundaries. You might be too involved with the student's situation. Or the opposite could happen. Maybe you end up completely withdrawing yourself from the student because you aren't able to be reminded of your own history. At that time, it is important that you get support, including maybe a trauma-focused treatment center, because it's never too late to be able to heal. Recognizing that what worked for you may not work for the student is also important. It is critical that as professionals, that we look at our own trauma history and remind ourselves that everyone does respond differently to trauma and trauma exposure. And finally, having our own trauma history, it can be a huge asset to students that it may provide you with great compassion and being able to understand where they are at. But in these cases, it is also important to make sure that you are constantly self-monitoring and maintaining the boundaries that you need. If you have a familiar history to a particular situation and student, it is good practice and very beneficial to consult regularly with your colleagues.